Unfortunately, it's getting harder to find raw milk and much more expensive. This is not due to danger from raw milk so much as that it's incompatible with a centralized corporate distribution and processing system. You can't simply let raw milk rot on the shelves for months on end like you can with highly pasteurized milk. Milk powder is often added to low fat and reduced fat milk, and this leads to oxidation and broken and cross linked protein strands from the pasteurization process. Worse, milk is often treated at extreme high temperatures now, called UHT, and this can completely denature the proteins. This leads to many problems such as leaky gut and allergies because many unusual proteins are created that are simply not meant for human consumption or indeed for consumption by any animal. The label may say it is organic and grass-fed, but many of these options are very processed and are not nearly as healthy as you might think. They're often less healthy than just the regular whole milk you would get, the store brand stuff. Thankfully, fermenting your milk a bit can resolve these issues, and it even increases the protein content of the end result by up to 25%. On top of all this, it actually tastes pretty good when you do it right.
Do you like it?
It's wonderful. I've never tasted anything like it.
Of course you haven't.
What is it?
The milk of human kindness.
But before I talk about that, I want to address something that keeps coming up over and over again. No matter how many times I talk about it, some people are just mystified when I say that raw meat doesn't have more nutrition than cooked meat. The story of Pottinger's cat is not a story about raw meat. It's a story about whole foods and eating the whole animal. Otherwise, it's impossible to get the amounts of taurine and glycine we need out of our diets, even on a meat-only diet. While there's cranks and scammers out there who promote raw meat and are constantly begging for contributions, they can't have really done all that much of it or they would see how impractical it is for most cuts of meat. There's no way on earth you'll bite into a rump roast or a brisket and manage to get the whole thing down. It's just way too tough. Even a bone-in porterhouse is quite hard to get down raw, and it's going to be really difficult to get all of the meat off the bone. But more importantly, you're discarding the biggest collagen source in the animal by far, the bones. In spite of endless talk about calcium, our bones are really just collagen with a small amount of minerals. You should always cook a steak with the bone in, and always save the juices for a sauce or gravy. This moisture lost from the steak will contain much of the taurine and glycine. Or better yet, make a soup. This guarantees no nutrients are lost, and both taurine and glycine are heat stable, so it's not an issue of heat. The collagen you do get from raw meat will seldom be fully digested because you simply won't be able to break it all down within your stomach. You can really only break it down by chewing it up really fine, just like a dog does when it has a bone. There's evidence of cooking food going back to Neanderthal times and even further beyond, at least 1 million years. And unless you can crack open raw bones with your teeth, that is going to work much better for you. Now, there's some truth to raw organ meat having more nutrients, but the strong taste makes it a bit hard for most people to deal with that, especially with the raw liver, though it's arguably better raw than it is cooked, unless you really know how to cook it well with like garlic and butter and stuff. You also don't really need the extra vitamins they provide if you already eat plenty of animal products. There's tons of DHEA in all meat, and that is the real form of vitamin C that your body is meant to use. While the vitamin C ascorbic acid levels are low in meat, that's not true of DHEA at all. Now, taurine and glycine, on the other hand, are going to be very lacking on a raw diet if you don't take very special measures.
Why are we deficient in glycine? Well, We all know that we have to eat whole grains in order to get the B vitamins we need. We discovered that 100 years ago. Whole grains, fine, but what about the whole pig, the whole chicken, and the whole fish, and the whole cow? Right, we cut off the muscle meats and we throw the bones away. But everybody knows grandma's chicken soup is so good for you. Why? Because you're boiling the collagen out of the bones. That's the protein, and that's where most of the glycine is. Well, it turns out that glycine is also an amino acid that, as the free amino acid, is needed in high concentration all the time in your body to keep those cells that do the inflammation from being hyperactive.
You can watch my Pottinger's Cats videos if you want more info on this, but please stop with the raw steak and hamburger nonsense. Though there's a place for raw food, especially raw organ meat, it really isn't something that everybody needs to be doing or that's required to get nutrition. It's just something that some people might do some of the time for specific reasons. And especially don't comment on it if you can't even bother to watch that video before commenting.
You need professional help, son.
He's getting it. It's not working.
Milk has a lot of benefits that are often overlooked. Everyone knows that whey protein is one of the best proteins for stimulating muscle growth, but casein is one of the most common proteins in milk and has many benefits. It's slow absorbing, which means it is particularly filling. In the golden era of bodybuilding, casein was extremely popular because its slow release nature meant that you would have a constant supply of amino acids for the body. In fact, the only reason whey protein became a big deal in the first place is because casein was pretty expensive, whereas whey protein was just thrown out because it's the leftovers from making cheese. When you have this slow release protein, it ensures your body will never have to burn lean tissue, which is very important when dieting in the standard manner, and especially for a competition preparation for a pro bodybuilder. And back in the day, they didn't have any special supplements that made sure you didn't lose muscle when doing this, and if you did it wrong, you'd lose a ton of muscle. Of course, with fasting, you don't lose lean tissue for fasts of less than 96 hours anyway, but this is just because the growth hormone release will regenerate lean tissue lost once you break the fast. Most of the time when you take in protein, you don't really do very much with it. You have to have the hormones stimulating the use of the protein to make muscle building and lean tissue building. And fasting does a great deal to make sure that you regenerate all of this tissue after you do the fast. And if you do worry about losing lean tissue while fasting, you can take glycine while fasting, and this will ensure your body simply doesn't consume much lean tissue in the first place. This also includes the fast we all embark on every night, sleep. This first part of the fast is also the most catabolic part. As soon as you go to bed, you start to lose lean tissue, basically. Or as soon as you stop eating, I should say. Old school bodybuilders knew this, and they often took casein supplements before bed, and you could get an even stronger effect by adding in some glycine on top of that. That's because glycine is one of the main substrates of gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose from protein in the body. When you have glycine in the bloodstream, your body simply does not need to break down more complex proteins to make glucose. A complaint many people have about dairy is constipation, and casein can be partly to blame for this. However, the real culprit is a low-fat diet. Dietary fat is critical for the digestive system, especially the mucus lining the intestines. If this is not working properly, food cannot move along as it should. Processed foods like wheat and sugar cause serious problems with this lining because they encourage the growth of harmful bacteria that exert a bad influence on the body. These bacteria don't want to be flushed out, they want to hold on at all costs, and they cause a great deal of inflammation. H. pylori will also lower stomach acid, which makes it harder to digest food and move it along. And this causes even worse problems because then you have all of these proteins that aren't properly digested, and you have a leaky gut. And what does that lead to? It leads to allergies and autoimmune disease. Unfortunately, we also need to be wary of food additives like PEG that thin the gut mucus and lead to problems. Polyethylene glycol is used in many foods, including some organic milk, to thin the fat and keep it emulsified. PEG not only destroys the mucus, which you need to stay regular, but it also directly causes leaky gut by making your gut more permeable. Worse yet, it is often sold as a laxative, which in the long term is going to cause very serious problems for your gut. So while you may think you have a problem with dairy, it's most likely really a problem with processed modern food. Milk directly from the cow often has a fat content of 8% or even as high as 15%, while so-called whole milk today only has 3.5%. This is a disaster not just for your gut, but also for how much low-fat skim milk is going to spike your insulin up. And after the insulin goes up, sugar goes down because the insulin drives it into your cells. And then you get low blood sugar and cortisol spikes to create more blood sugar. This causes more hunger, and then you eat more, then it's going to cause the same problem. Cortisol's main job is to produce glucose, but most people don't realize it also makes your cells insulin resistant in order to keep the glucose reserved for the brain, because basically it thinks that you're being attacked by a bear, when in reality you're just being attacked by a Hostess cupcake. When you're fasted, high cortisol is fine, but when you're constantly in a high cortisol state while insulin is also high, this means the only way that you can create this glucose is from lean tissue, and this leads to a great deal of lean tissue loss over time. When you have fat with a meal, insulin spikes are blunted and your blood sugar and hunger are much more manageable. When our ancestors drank milk, it was not only full of fat, but also full of L. reuteri bacteria. L. reuteri and other lactobacilli are the main type of probiotics people use and seem to be the most beneficial ones. This is one of the biggest benefits of raw milk, and while reuteri was once common in the human gut microbiome, its prevalence has fallen off dramatically in recent decades. L. reuteri is known to colonize the small intestines as opposed to the colon, and importantly they kill off the negative bacteria which can lead to SIBO, and many pathogenic bacteria that simply don't belong in the human body and can cause a great deal of damage. These bacteria actually use glycerol, the backbone of fat molecules, to produce a biocide that kills other bacteria. They also produce vinegar, which not only kills off pathogenic gut bacteria, but is also a short-chain fatty acid that has many health benefits in the body. While many obsess on butyrate, in reality butyrate is a bit player in the human microbiome. Around 70 to 80% of the short-chain fatty acids produced in the human gut are actually vinegar. It's really only about 5 to 10% that's butyrate. And while you might think that consuming fiber will increase the butyrate in your gut, in reality what happens is that more of the butyrate is absorbed by this fiber and it just gets flushed right out of the body. So you can wind up actually producing less butyrate. And vinegar is what you really want because this is what goes into the Krebs cycle as well. Everything else has to be processed before it's used for energy, and others like butyric acid just don't quite have the same effect as vinegar, and propionic acid is known to have extremely negative effects, and that's the short-chain fatty acid that tends to get produced when you have a lot of wheat and sugar. L. reuteri is also known to reverse the effects of a high fructose diet in mice and children. Reuteri and other lactobacilli have become very popular supplements, but if you use them as a starter culture in milk at home, they are much cheaper and you can get a much higher dose. It also resolves the issues I mentioned with dairy earlier. The broken and misfolded proteins will be consumed and turned into proteins usable by the human body. Any oxidated fats or cholesterol will likewise be rendered harmless. In fact, the fat profile will actually improve as much of the linoleic acid will be converted into conjugated linoleic acid, which has many health benefits and is often used as a supplement. And these are just some of the ways that L. reuteri creates an amazing effect in the body.
I've previously talked about how our reuteri yogurt that we make ourselves has some very interesting properties. For instance, it causes release of oxytocin from the brain, from the hypothalamus. That in turn has some pretty incredible effects, including an acceleration of healing. Healing is an index of youthfulness, and so we have youthful healing restored. It increases dermal collagen, and so many people actually lose wrinkles, or at least have their wrinkles reduced in depth and prominence. It suppresses appetite, the so-called anorexigenic effect. It increases muscle and strength. So personally, my muscle and strength have gone way up back to where I was maybe when I was 18 or 19 years old. It increases testosterone in males. It increases libido. In other words, some very, very age-reversing effects, interesting age-reversing effects.
About half of the activity of the immune system is simply keeping pathogens in the gut in check and keeping them from invading the body and killing you. And keep in mind, only your immune system can heal damage to the body, and this includes the damage of aging and also cancer as well. Whenever you eat, the bacteria in your gut go wild and multiply very quickly, and this forces the immune system to spend more and more of its efforts fighting pathogens. And as I've shown in other videos, this is the real reason that NAD+ becomes depleted in the body. As you age, you're just spending more and more time trying to fight these pathogens, and you can't heal the body anymore. This is what triggers the CD38 enzyme, which is consuming tons and tons of NAD+ in the body. Fasting helps a great deal with this because it takes pressure off the immune system, and it also regenerates it. Probiotics like reuteri can also help a great deal. It's important to realize that the phagocytes that get stuck in this CD38 cycle, they get reset when you fast, so you'll stop wasting NAD+. Otherwise, as you age, they just use more and more of the CD38 in order to fight pathogens, and you'll just have less and less left over to undo the damage from aging. Well, Dr. William Davis has a process to create yogurt which takes 36 hours. I have a process that I like a little bit better. First off, I use an instapot. This is the easiest way to do things. All you have to do is put in the ingredients and hit the yogurt button. In theory, anyway. The problem here is the consistency is not always great, and it can mold if you ferment it for a very long time. Instead, I put less than a quarter gallon of milk into the pot, and then I put in the starter probiotic. Basically some crushed up pills or an empty capsule in there. And every 3 hours, the bacteria should double. So if you do this for, say, 12 hours, then you can pour the rest of the milk in, and then let it go for another 12 hours or so, and you're going to get a much better result. And then mix it up when you're done, and then put it into the jar. Mixing it up is important because it helps thicken it up. But it's probably still going to be thin and runny the first couple of times you do it. But as you use the same product over and over again as a starter, just using a little bit of the last batch, then eventually you'll get a good yogurt that's going to taste really nice and have a good consistency and be really thick. And when you make another batch, all you have to do is put in, say, a quarter of your old batch, and then put it in for another 12 hours, then you're good to go. Now, I often use the BioGaia starters, but also lately I've been using the Vitamin Shop reuteri blend. And this has a bunch of different stuff in there. And it's important to realize that reuteri has a lot of benefits, but it's not the only beneficial bacteria out there. The bifidobacteria, for example, these kinds of bacteria are also highly helpful for the body. So you can just play around with it and just see what works best for you, basically. You also don't need to put the inulin in that some people put in there, which is basically a prebiotic fiber. It's totally pointless. The reuteri uses the lactose, proteins, and fat in milk for its nutrients, and this is enough for it to grow very quickly. It doesn't need any extra additives, especially not another carb source. The probiotics will have a great effect on their own, but they will also improve the nutritional quality and quantity of the milk itself. Much of the lactose will be consumed and ultimately turned into protein, and this will increase the protein in the final product by around 25%, while at the same time dramatically lowering the carbs. Pasteurization damaged proteins will be consumed and turned into essential amino acids in the proper ratios for human consumption. And in fact, that's exactly how cows make those amino acids themselves. They use the bacteria in their stomach to create them. Unfortunately, humans really can't do that in their own stomach very well. Any oxidized cholesterol and fat from the added powdered milk will also be reconstructed into normal cholesterol, and some of the linoleic acid will be turned into conjugated linoleic acid. This is a very purifying process, and it is very similar to what the cow does, and that's why beef seldom causes an allergic reaction. While it's still technically not raw, the nutrition you gain will be better than if you had taken raw milk in most ways. The notable exception to this is that lactoferrin is completely removed by pasteurization, and this enzyme is quite helpful for gut health, so that's one reason tracking down some raw dairy could be very helpful to you. And there's no reason not to do this with some raw dairy either. It's already probably going to have some reuteri in there, and you can just let it sit for a few days and you're good to go. And on top of all of this, reuteri also changes the short chain fatty acid content of the gut. It increases the healthy vinegar, while it greatly reduces the propionate, which is associated with autism spectrum disorders and many other health issues. And I think that a lot of people are getting a lot of issues from this because we're eating foods that create a lot of propionate these days, which is basically processed foods. They're just not getting it to nearly the same degree as people who are actually autistic. And when you've been doing it for a while, you'll eventually get yogurt that's very tasty, but you'll have to experiment with it a bit to get it just right. To me, it tastes great plain, it's nice and tangy, but it usually takes a few batches using the last batch as a starter before it settles down into a nice flavor and especially consistency. That's where it's really not going to work out at first. It's probably going to be runny for at least the first batch or two. While I don't recommend honey as a health food, like many misguided souls out there do, this is one place a small amount of honey will go a long way to make it more pleasant for the picky eaters out there. A single tablespoon for the entire gallon will have a surprisingly noticeable effect. And I don't really do that for myself, but since other people eat it too, if they're having some, I'll just put a little honey in there and stir it around, and I get far fewer complaints. And it's not a large amount, it's just a small amount of honey is all you need. Some people also put in artificial sweeteners, but I definitely don't recommend that. I found my gut bloating goes dramatically down whenever I stop them, and if I slip up in my diet and I have some more diet soda, it comes right back. So this may not be an issue for everyone, but I bet you that everybody experiences that to a lesser degree. It's simply just not something that's healthy for you. I don't think there's any good artificial sweeteners out there. Though they're probably not causing instant brain cancer or anything like that, they're definitely not good for you. While fasting can be hard, the foods that are healthy for you already taste delicious. Eating healthy doesn't require you to sacrifice nearly as much as you might think.
What's that like the taste of butter? What's that?